Of BookExpo America taking place this year inside McCormick Place Convention Center in Chicago. Understanding Islam, how books can foster dialogue in a faith-fractured world was a topic of this panel recorded yesterday. It's an hour, 10 minutes.
Good morning. Welcome to BEA's first ever Religion and Spirituality Day. A long overdue recognition of the importance of that category in my mind. And welcome to the panel, Understanding Islam, How Books Can Foster Dialogue in a Faith-Fractured World. I have one announcement to make before we begin. Although Irshad Manji's name was in the program book, she was not able to join us this morning. In November 2000, we ran a story in Publishers Weekly headlined, "Islamic Publishing is Poised for Growth." Not prescient exactly, since it was obvious by then that this rapidly growing segment of the U.S. population would inspire more books for and about them. At that time, there were some serious books on Islamic culture and history, but when it came to sales, in the general trade, the category was dominated by popular treatments of Sufism and translations of the Sufi poet Rumi. Barely a year later, publishing about Islam took a tragic turn. In the wake of the events of September 11, 2001, it suddenly became urgent for non-Muslims to understand the religion of the 9/11 terrorists, the religion they claimed had motivated and sanctioned their actions. Books about Islam began to fly out of bookstores, and publishers scrambled to get new titles out. Although the initial rush eventually slowed, titles that examine the beliefs and politics of Muslims have found a lasting place in American publishing and bookselling. As they struggle to understand a changed world, people are asking hard questions about Islam. Is it a religion of peace any more or any less than Christianity and Judaism? Has Islam been hijacked by extremists, as some have said, or do the terrorists represent an authentic interpretation of the Quran's teachings? How does the West need to change in its attitudes towards Islam? And how does Islam need to change in relation to global culture and politics? Do religions in general contribute to a better world or a worse one? I've asked these distinguished authors to speak about the messages and motivations for their own books and about the role books can have in today's crucial conversations about Islam. John Esposito is University Professor of Religion and International Affairs, Professor of Islamic Studies, and Founding Director of the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at the Walsh School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University. Esposito is the author of more than 30 books on Islam and is the editor-in-chief of the 4-volume Oxford Encyclopedia of the Modern Islamic World, the Oxford History of Islam, the Oxford Dictionary of Islam, and the Islamic World Past and Present. His books, translated into Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Japanese, Chinese, and European languages, include What Everyone Needs to Know About Islam, Unholy War, Terror in the Name of Islam, The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality, Islam and Politics, and many others. A former president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America and a professor of religion and international affairs at Georgetown University, Esposito founded the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding in 1993 to foster a better understanding of Islam and of Muslim-Christian relations in the West. He is also a consultant to the U.S. Department of State and to corporations, universities, and media worldwide. Esposito is widely interviewed and quoted in the media, including the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, network news stations, NPR, BBC, and in media throughout Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Professor Esposito.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to try to talk about how I see the development of coverage of Islam. Let me begin with a story. About 5 years ago, I was speaking at the University of Maine, and it was one of the rare occasions when my parents happened to attend something that I did. And during a faculty social. People kept coming up to me and saying how cute my mother was. So I finally said, well, what is it? I mean, I figured, well, she's a short Italian woman, and so she fulfills their stereotype. And they said, no. We said to her, you know, how does it feel to see your son in front of hundreds of people speaking? You know, what do you think? And she said, all I kept thinking of is, thank God he has a job. Thank God he has a job. And I think that reflects the realities of the presence of Islam in our consciousness and the study of Islam. If you go back 25, 30 years, Islam was invisible on our religious, geographic, and cognitive landscapes. It was marginal in our educational, media, and publishing outlets. Do a search and take a look at the number of books and reference books that existed 25 or 30 years ago and before. Take a look at introductions to Islam that were out at that time. When I decided to write an introduction to Islam, which was much later, in the mid to late 80s, people said, why was I doing it? There were already intros out there. But the major intros were 20 or 30 years old, number one. Number two, the shortest chapter in the book was one chapter covering often the 19th and 20th century and doing it in 15 pages, saying an awful lot about whether or not we saw Islam as ever changing, saying an awful lot about whether or not we thought anything had really happened in the 19th and 20th century. The realities are that in the late 1960s, when I decided to get into the field, although Islam was the second largest religion in the world, it was virtually invisible in Europe and America. Today, 30, 35 years later, Islam is the second or third largest religion in Europe and America. And Islam, both because it's the second largest religion in the world and because its presence in the West, as well as because of the threat of global terrorism from Muslim extremists, therefore is very much on our screen. So it's gone from, in a sense, invisibility to visibility. When I finished my degree in '74, from '74 to '79, I was, as I like to put it, the Maytag repairman of my profession. The phone never rang. I sat in the proverbial ivory tower. I can still picture the office I sat in. No one invited me to speak. If I went to professional meetings to speak, even the American Academy of Religions, I was always very nervous because it might be that only 3 people would be in the room, and I was untenured at the time and kept thinking somebody back at the university is going to hear that only 3 people are there. Therefore, why do we have him? When I got my first job teaching world religions, that's what the job was for. It was not to teach Islam. This was in the early 70s. Everything changed with the Iranian Revolution in many ways. I often say I owe my career and my Lexus to the Ayatollah Khomeini, and it's not that far off the mark. Publishing took off remarkably. Since 1979, one cannot publish books or write them fast enough if you've got a book and a book that's worthwhile in terms of publishing. So I think it's important to realize how much things have changed. But, we've gone from a bear to a bull market, but why? It was the Iranian Revolution and the threat of the export of revolution. Then it was the Gulf War of 1991 that kind of, goosed things up again when things were really getting kind of flat. And then 9/11 made all the difference in the world. I mean, you're correct. After 9/11, books flew off the shelf, but the irony was if you looked at what was selling, it wasn't just books that were going to really help you to understand global terrorism. You had books on Middle East cuisine. I mean, anything that was remotely seen as related to Islam was out there. That change has been significant. The motivations that I found myself having was that after 78, 79, the opportunity was there to basically look around and say, what do we need? And indeed, again, you can go back and do a search. We needed a hell of a lot. We needed basic intros on Islam. We needed basic reference books. There were some, but not many. And that's why I did all of those reference books. Now, one should be sitting there saying, but if Islam is the second largest religion in the world even then, and was present at that time in more than, let's say, 45 or 50 countries, why didn't we have an Oxford Encyclopedia of the modern Islamic world? Why didn't we have an Oxford History of Islam? Why didn't we have a handy Oxford Dictionary of Islam? Why weren't those things out there? Why didn't we have even books dealing with the role of religion in politics at the time? Because for a decade before the Iranian Revolution, Islam had been asserted by regimes in Libya, in Egypt, Anwar Sadat, in Sudan, and in Pakistan. In Pakistan, they had promised an Islamic government. It wasn't until the Iranian Revolution that we noticed all the, quote, religion and politics that was taking place for a decade before. 9/11, in many ways, was a tragic turning point. On the one hand, one could see it as an opportunity to look at and say, what went wrong? What's happening? Why is it happening? Why do they hate us? Also, what do we need to know about Islam? But part of the difficulty is that the response to 9/11, again, is out of a negative mode. It's know the threat. It's not know the 1.2 billion Muslims or 2.5 billion Muslims who are ordinary believers like everybody else. It's know that radical minority in some way or another that tended to frame the questions. I wrote Unholy War, Terror in the Name of Islam, and I remember when I was asked by Oxford to do it, I had thought I'd just update Islamic threat. I said, I don't just want to do a bin Laden book. I want to explain the bin Laden phenomenon, but I want to explain where did it come from and how broad-based is it and what do we need to know? Where do we go from here? So it's not just why do they hate us, you know, and addressing that in a serious way, other than simply saying it's a clash of values, but looking at root causes, but also where do we go from here? I wanted to be able to talk about the transcendent as well as the dark side of religion, which exists in all of religions. And I think that that was the main purpose. But throughout writing of that book, my wife kept pressing me and saying, you shouldn't be writing that book right now. You should be doing a question and answer book, what everyone needs to know about Islam. And I said, well, I wrote an introduction, Islam, the Straight Path. Why do we need a Q&A? My wife said, do you notice how long you've been in the field, and yet note the questions you're being asked by government, by media, by corporate world, by general audience. They're all the basic questions. What do Muslims believe? What is the relationship of Islam to Judaism and Christianity? Does Islam have any notion of peace? On the other hand, is Islam basically a religion that preaches violence and terrorism? What about women? What about gender? All of those very basic issues. In many ways, and this is, in some ways, it's a kind of funny secret of my career. I have the only profession where, in fact, I've been asked the same questions for 30 or 35 years. I mean, it's absolutely wonderful. I mean, it changes a bit, I mean, in terms of post-9/11, but you're still answering questions. Think about this. You're still answering questions from people who say, is there something especially violent about Islam? Well, what does the Quran have to say about violence and terrorism? Well, given all the brain power we have and all the publications, given the intelligence of most publics, how come we keep asking the same question? We don't keep asking the same question about Christianity and Judaism, even though Jews and Christians engage in acts of violence, blow up people in places. In our gut, we immediately distinguish that from mainstream Christianity and Judaism, or at least most of us do. Some of us may smile and chuckle and make other statements, depending on our backgrounds, whether or not we're even reacting to our backgrounds. But with regard to Islam and Muslims, there's still an exceptionalism there. It doesn't matter how much time has gone on. It doesn't matter how many books are out there. These very basic fundamental issues are asked, and the same group of people will come back and ask this over and over again. The same group of people, whether it's from media or from government. I think that says something about where we are and what we need to think about. Today, you know, what do we need to think about? What do we need to be addressing? Well, it seems to me we have to appreciate and address in a variety of ways the fact that religions have their transcendent and their dark sides, all of them, historically. Religions are about a transcendent reality, but also religions help people transcend their baser instincts, transcend themselves. On the other hand, all religions have had their dark side. Religions are about peace, but all religions have dealt with conflict. I often send my students selections from the Quran out of context and selections from the Hebrew Bible out of context that deal with violence, and say to them, read these and then tell me what conclusions would you draw when you look at these taken out of context. And then statements from major Christians over the years out of context, and some within context. Some of the more militant members of the Christian right, for example. In that context, then, we have to be able to more and more, it seems to me, in publishing, not only look at extremism, but also the mainstream, but do it in an interesting and fascinating way. Because as with the news media, most of the news media is not interested in what the ordinary Muslim does, except for an occasional story. What they're interested in is the headline or the explosive event. That means that we have to think about creative ways to do it. We need to know more about the religion of Islam in its diversity in the different cultures. I find that I just did a debate on Islam and democracy in the UK, and they sold it out, 800 people. But what was really infuriating is to have somebody in the audience, first of all, quote the Quran out of context, and to quote only the first part of a verse. We're still doing it, even though there's a lot out there. But to have a woman in the audience talk about women in Islam as if all the women in Islam are women living under the Taliban. All the women in Islam don't, as Malaysian women do, ride on motorcycles, work in the marketplace, even if they're Islamically dressed, etc. But all Muslim women can't drive cars. All Muslim women are in oppressive situations. That diversity that we know in Christianity and Judaism has to be appreciated when it comes to Islam. And also, we have to look at the theology of hate. We have to understand the struggle that is taking place within Islam itself between a mainstream majority and a minority that have a theology of hate, and how theologies of hate take on a life of their own. But we have to do it comparatively. We have to realize that we have our own theologies of hate. We have mainstream, ultra-conservative Christian and Jewish leaders, without even getting into Hinduism, that have a theological worldview. They're not violent, but a theological worldview that is us and them, black and white, army of God, and therefore the others are the army of Satan. And we have to realize that that kind of exclusivist, non-pluralist, intolerant theology easily becomes a theology of violence and terror in the hands of those that wish to commit violence, because it provides a worldview that can legitimate that. We need to take a look at converts to Islam. There's a recent report, even though Britain is becoming very secular and non-church going, many converts are occurring in Britain, and many from very prominent, well-educated backgrounds. We have the same thing in America. We should be doing work on that, because that would answer a basic question for lots of people. Lots of people like to think that when somebody is a convert, it's because they have a psychological problem or because of marriage. How do you deal with people who come from good family backgrounds, good educations, and who embrace Islam? Then there must be something in Islam that even we, whoever we are, can relate to. You know, as one TV group recently said, can you tell us about some Caucasian, that's the key, converts? Because the whole idea is, boy, you know, it's amazing if a Caucasian could be attracted. I don't know whether or not I qualify as a Caucasian. I'm also not a Muslim, but in any case, trying to figure out that Caucasian. I've heard that from a lot of people. But I think that that's the kind of thing that we have to look at. Right now I'm writing a book called The Future of Islam. And there, I'm addressing a number of issues that I think can be addressed in a variety of books today, because the issues are still out there. Is this a clash between an Islam which is traditional, authoritarian, anti-Western, and some sort of modern, developed, democratic world? Is Islam incompatible with science, technology, modern capitalism, contemporary life? Again, I've been asked that question for the last 20 years. 9/11, we raise it again. It's as if people don't see how people in Turkey and Malaysia and other sectors of Muslim society live. They just look at the non-developed part of that society, which in fact exists in an awful lot of other non-developed societies. Is there something peculiar in Islam that tends to support authoritarianism, limit free speech, support weak civil societies? Why are so many Muslim governments authoritarian? People raise that question all the time. I think we need to see more writing on that, because that gets at the nature of Islam, and that gets at questions that people raise when they look at Reconstruction in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Why is it that the American government, and that many experts, weren't prepared for the role of the Shia in Iraq? What does that say? In 2003, 2004, with all of our expertise, with all that's happened, we didn't have a sense that religion would play a role and that the Shia would play a role. And we didn't have a sense that when you deal with Shia Islam, it doesn't mean that just because Shia are going to play a prominent role, there's going to be a theocracy. It doesn't mean that they're all extremist. We weren't able initially to realize that there could be a world of difference between Sistani and Muqtada Sadr. I think all of those things become important. And finally, and I think very importantly, it is fair to say, and one would need to unpack this, and we don't have time now, that we need to recognize, despite what some people say about the death of political Islam, or that somehow there's this great disaffection, and there is, among many Muslims in Iran and others over the failures. The fact is, in many Muslim societies today, and in many Muslim communities today, Islam is alive and well and growing. And so there is an Islamization within that society. And that doesn't mean it's necessarily a threat. And my last point, and I say this to all audiences that I speak to, because of our library systems today, our publishing systems today, and Google, God bless Google, hopefully that'll help its stock, the reality of it is you can check out what people say, anything that I say. Well then, damn it, check out what a lot of people say when they write about Muslims in America or publicly. People use statistics like 85% of our mosques are controlled by extremists. They provide no footnotes. One writer, ideologue, likes to see himself as a scholar, writes in a lot of newspaper columns, in his book, says things like 85% are extremist or run by fundamentalists, that major groups are extremists or supporters of Hamas or whatever group, and says often in this text that this is based on data, studies, etc., and it's a book with footnotes, but that writer has no footnotes at all. The fact that we can do that and get away with it is absolutely fascinating. You could not do the same with Judaism. You could not do the same with mainstream Christianity and get away with it continuously. Nor could you have a media where you have very conservative talk show hosts literally spewing forth hate about Arabs and Muslims. I mean, we're talking about the language of violence and not having that become anything other than issuing stories that seem to actually give them even more attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to have you hold your questions to the end. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Asma Gull Hasan is the author of Why I Am a Muslim and American Muslims, the New Generation. The daughter of Pakistani immigrants and born in Chicago, she likes to call herself a Muslim feminist cowgirl, reflecting her upbringing in Colorado. Hasan has been a columnist for the Denver Post and the Pakistan Link newspapers. Her op-eds have been published in the New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, on BeliefNet.com, in the Dallas Morning News, among many others. She's a frequent guest on the Fox News Channel, particularly Hannity and Colmes, From the Heartland with John Kasich, The O'Reilly Factor. Hasan has also been featured on Fresh Air with Terry Gross, Morning Edition, and Weekend Edition on NPR, on CNN, CNN International, C-SPAN, and Politically Incorrect with Bill Maher on ABC. She's been profiled in USA Today and interviewed in the New York Times. In September 2002, Hasan appeared on the History Channel documentary Inside Islam. She graduated from New York University School of Law, is also a graduate of Wellesley College, magna cum laude, and a Durant Scholar. The U.S. State Department selected Hasan as an ambassador in the public relations campaign with the Islamic world. She's spoken across the country at universities including Harvard, Hofstra, and Montclair, and at organizations such as the National Association of Bilingual Educators, Kalamazoo County Government, and National Association of Multicultural Educators. She has contributed to essay collections, including the books Taking Back Islam, I Like Being an American, and It's a Free Country. Hasan serves as an editor of the monthly online publication, The American Muslim.
Hello. Thank you all for coming. Thanks for having me. It's such an honor for me to be on this panel with these fellow authors and with Ms. Garrett. And I just want to thank Lynn for having me, and also thank Lynn and Publishers Weekly for everything they do for books and for my book in particular. Authors, we need all the help we can get. So anyway, so it's great for me to be here, and Professor, it's really an honor for me to be here with Professor Esposito. He's been such an inspiration to me. When I first started learning about Islam from an academic perspective, from a scholarly perspective, I read about this professor from Georgetown, and I couldn't believe, this person who had written so much about Islam and spoke so favorably of Islam was not a Muslim himself. I was just amazed, because my experience growing up in the United States, the only people who spoke well of Muslims were other Muslims, and mainly my family members. So as far as I knew, I was not related to the professor, and he was not Muslim, so it was quite exciting for me and very empowering. So, as we talked about, I just recently published a book called Why I Am a Muslim, and maybe we should show it. This is my first book, and then this is that's my second book, and this is my first. And Professor Esposito is lucky that I don't think his publishers want to put his picture on the cover, but each of mine were like, oh, let's put you on the cover, you know. And my poor sister got included on my first one, and so she's always like, I hate that picture. When will that book go away? Or at least come out with a cover without, you know, her picture on it. But unfortunately, Imam Rauf and I, our pictures are captured forever in time on the covers. You know? But I've been promoting my second book, and you know, traveling a lot for that. And one of the things that, you know, that when you're traveling, you know, you call the airline to make travel arrangements, things, confirm reservations at hotels and whatnot. And so I'll call and I'll say, hi, I'm Asma Hasan, I'm calling to confirm. And they'll say, okay, let me look you up. Okay, Osama, we have you coming in on Wednesday and leaving on Friday. And I'll say, wait, hold on. My name's not Osama. Oh, okay, Osama. Thanks very much. You know, and I'll say, well, no, it's spelled ASMA. And particularly for airline reservations, I'm very sensitive on that one, because if your ID does not have the same name as your ticket, then you're in big trouble at airport security. Especially, I would imagine, if one of those names is Osama on the ticket or on the ID, you know, and they don't match. So I don't know where it comes from, but I think it just shows sort of how fixated our society is on 9/11. And it's natural. 9/11 was a tragic, horrible event. I think none of us will ever forget that day, and it's changed all of our lives. So I think it's natural for people, when they see ASMA, to want to pronounce it Osama. You know, they just sort of can't help themselves. Even people I've known for years, you know, will say, hi, Osama, you know, at the Christmas party or whatever, and I'll say, but I'm Asma. You should know. For us as American Muslims, I think that's one of our biggest challenges, is dealing with, you know, stereotypes, with preconceived notions, with attitudes. You know, we deal with those daily as American Muslims. When I go to events to speak about my book, you know, a lot, and usually it's non-Muslims, and so when I get there, the organizer often will not realize that I'm the speaker. They'll think that I'm just somebody coming to attend the event. And so when I introduce myself and say, oh, you know, I'm the author, you know, I'm the one here to speak. Really? Well, you don't look like a Muslim. I wouldn't even have recognized you. And despite the fact that my, you know, picture's on the cover, but you know, I don't know what they're expecting. Maybe they haven't read the book. Maybe that's the problem. But, you know, I think people have this idea when they hear that a Muslim woman is coming. I think they expect somebody who, you know, who's sort of covered from head to toe and has a heavy accent. Some people don't even know that I'm female. They can't tell by my name, so they're expecting a man. So they say, oh, had I known you were a woman, I wouldn't have asked you. You know, I know Muslim women, you know, don't like to do things, you know, in public, and I mean, and that's just silly. Even women who cover, you know, are very outgoing, and you know, they don't are not necessarily shy. You know, another problem that I face sometimes, or not a problem, but you know, a similar sort of issue, when I go to speaking events, the organizer will say, you know, it's so great for this community to have an Arab come here. You know, I don't think anybody here knows any Arabs, and I'll say, well, oh, yeah, I can set you up with an Arab, but I'm actually not Arab, I'm sorry to say. And I feel really bad because, you know, this particular person feels like they're really reaching out and really making an effort. And you, as a Muslim, I want to embrace that, and I want to congratulate them and, you know, give them positive reinforcement and say, that's good that you're trying to learn more about Muslims. But it's going to start now with learning that not all Muslims are Arabs. Actually, only about 20% of Muslims in the world and in the United States are Arab. Actually, majority of Muslims in the United States and in the world are South Asian and Asian descent, like me. So, you know, so you deal with little, you know, issues like that. And I think this naturally leads to the question, why do it? Why be a Muslim in America? You know, why not go live in Pakistan, where my parents are from, where I'm sure no one would call me Osama, no one would think that I was Arab. Why not just go there? Well, I personally feel that by being an American, it makes me a better Muslim. I think Imam Rauf and I would agree on this, he talks about this in his book, that there are certain values that are important in Islam that are a part of American society also. And I'll let him talk about those, since I think he does a very good job of discussing them. For me, being an American and a Muslim gives me a chance to approach Islam from a fresh perspective, and not from the perspective of a Pakistani or from a cultural perspective, perspective, but sort of with a fresh start, because I'm growing up in the United States, I'm living in the United States, I'm away from sort of the cultural infrastructure, the sort of military-industrial complex that's behind the culture of Pakistan that affects how Pakistani Muslims interpret and practice Islam. And this happens in all Islamic countries. For every Muslim, there's a culture that's behind them that affects how they practice their Islam and, you know, how they interpret the Islam. And oftentimes it results in things that have nothing to do with Islam and that, you know, we hear about in the media that we say, well, that's horrible. Why are they doing that? And it's important to remember that's not Islam telling them to do that. That's their own culture. I'm going to tell you a little story, a quick story. When my sister was getting married, which was a couple years ago, we were going to do a traditional South Asian wedding. And so, but being American, we had to make a program for the wedding. No one had really made a program for a South Asian wedding before. Usually it's sort of done haphazardly the day of the wedding, you know, who's going to accompany the bride and whatever. And one of the important aspects about accompanying the bride is that she should be accompanied by other happily married ladies. And their good luck in marriage ideas will rub off on the bride. So, you know, so they'll send her off into a happy marriage, and when they accompany her down the aisle to meet the groom. So my mom and I were working on the program because we had to send it to the printer at least a month in advance. And my mom said, who are the happily married ladies going to be? And I was like, well, what do you mean? Who are the happily married ladies? And she explained to me the tradition, you know, the happily married ladies accompanying the bride. And I said, wait a second. Hold on. I've been to several South Asian weddings, and none of the women accompanying the bride have been happily married. I know this for a fact. I see them and I say, hey, you know, that lady, you know, she doesn't even talk to her husband. I didn't even know that lady had a husband because, you know, she's never with him. So I was quite surprised, and I was actually very disturbed because if you really believe in that superstition, then you're sort of dooming these brides to a bad marriage, you know, because they're being accompanied by women who are actually badly married, not happily married. So, you know, and my mom said, I said, how does this happen? You know, my mom said, well, you know, it all happens on the day of the wedding, and there's so much, you know, craziness, and you know, every woman wants to show off in front of the other women, and they all volunteer, whether they have a good marriage or not. You know, no woman's like, no, that's okay. My marriage is bad. Don't pick me. Pick my friend. She has a great marriage. So I was very worried about this. So I said, well, I'm going to do some due diligence. I'm going to actually find some happily married women to accompany my sister. And it was hard work, but I managed to find 6 happily married women who were family friends, South Asian. They accompanied my sister down the aisle. They were in the program. And it you know, although it was tough, I can now go to bed at night and not, you know, wake up, you know, every morning thinking, oh my God, I sent my sister down the aisle with 6 horribly married women. So, you know, I think things like that are fun. You know, it's part of my culture as a South Asian. It's sort of entertaining and, you know, makes life interesting. But I realized in doing all this and finding, you know, the 6 happily married women, there was nothing in the Quran about this. There was nothing in the Quran that said, when you get married, when a woman gets married, she must have 6 other women with her who are happily married to bless her marriage as a good luck charm. There's nothing in the Quran about that. In fact, what the Quran says about marriage is sort of legalistic, you know, that there must be a marriage contract, that both parties must agree, you know, the husband and the wife. You know, there's sort of nothing about, you know, the rituals of the wedding. That's what comes from the culture. You know, I realize that, you know, there's a lot of things as Muslims that we do that I get from my own South Asian culture that has nothing to do with Islam. That's not in the Quran. And a lot of it's fun stuff that's neat and interesting, like the happily married ladies. But a lot of it's also things that are negative that we see about on TV, you know, like female circumcision, honor killings, patriarchy against women. These things are much older than Islam, and they existed much longer before Islam ever came into existence. Islam is about 1,400 years old, which I know is, you know, seems like a long time, and it is, but it's in terms of culture and the way cultures are and the practices people have, it's not a very long time. You know, there's so many traditions and practices that have been with the people who later converted to Islam, and one of them is this, you know, happily married ladies in South Asia. So, you know, for all of you, next time you see something on television and it's a Muslim doing something, you know, sit back and ask yourself, is that in the Quran? Is the Quran telling them to do that? Or is that something that's a part of their culture that they're just sort of acting out on? I think that as an American, as a Muslim, that I'm very lucky because I'm sort of freed from that cultural baggage in the sense that I can subscribe to it, or if I want to, I don't have to. You know, whereas if I grew up in Pakistan, all those things would be sort of mandatory. You know, no one would question the happily married ladies at all, and you know, just sort of be standard. At least now I'm free to sort of say, when I get married, I don't want to have the traditional South Asian wedding. I want to have, you know, my own. I make up my own culture or have an American-style wedding. I do say, though, that if I do decide to have a South Asian wedding, I'm going to have 6 happily married career women accompany me. So I imagine this will be even tougher than finding the 6 happily married ladies. So I think I'm going to broaden the search outside of the South Asian community. So if you'd like to volunteer for that position, and you know, let's all be honest, ladies, you know, you don't want to doom me to a bad marriage and bad career. So, I always say that that's what I'll do if I choose to have a South Asian wedding. But thank you very much for coming. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of the day, and I hope you all pick up one of my books that are sitting outside. Thank you.
Thank you, Asma. Imam Feisal Abdul Rauf is the founder and CEO of the American Sufi Muslim Association and Imam of Masjid al-Farah. Hope I didn't mess that up too badly. A mosque in New York City, 12 blocks from Ground Zero. He describes himself as dedicated to building bridges between Muslims and the West and is a leader in the effort to integrate Islam into modern American society. Born in Kuwait in 1948 in an Egyptian family, Imam Feisal was educated in England and Malaysia and has a degree in physics from Columbia University. He is the architect of the Cordoba Initiative, an interreligious blueprint for improving relations between America and the Muslim world and pursuing peace in the Middle East through an ecumenical solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Imam Feisal speaks frequently at major international conferences, has appeared on CNN, CBS, NBC, ABC, PBS, and the BBC, and has been quoted in the New York Times, New York Daily News, the Jerusalem Post, and the Associated Press. He is a member of the World Economic Forum's Council of 100 Leaders and the Board of Trustees of the Islamic Center in New York. He is also an advisor to the Interfaith Center of New York. He is the author of Islam, A Search for Meaning, Islam, A Sacred Law. His new book, What's Right with Islam, A New Vision for Muslims and the West, was published by Harper San Francisco in May. Imam Feisal.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. Einstein was once asked of his contributions, and he said, "We just stand on the shoulders of giants." And the nice thing about coming after Professor John Esposito and Asma Gull Hasan is that I feel the ability to stand on their shoulders. After 9/11, I was invited to lecture in many situations, in churches, synagogues, you name it. And many of the frequently asked questions were repeated. The what is Islam category of questions, why do they hate us, as John mentioned. And after answering most of these frequently asked questions came the real tough one. Well, what can we do about it? How can we fix it? So I was also urged to write a book in which I answered many of these questions and tried to find ways to enable Americans to see the gulf between America and the Muslim world through Muslim eyes. Both to see the issues through Muslim eyes and to see America itself through Muslim eyes. One day I was invited to be part of a panel at St. Bartholomew's Church for the Abraham book. And there I met Jane Friedman, who is gracing us today, the chairman of HarperCollins. I didn't know who she was at the time. There's all these people from HarperCollins. And here is this lady with such power asserting, if resigning my position would result in peace between Israelis and Palestinians, I would do it tomorrow. And I saw all these eyes rolling over, say, oh yeah. But that was my challenge, and I went up to her and At that very time, I was struggling with exactly the formulation, which was, if I had the resources to heal the relationship between the Muslim world and the West, what would I do? And the answer to that question, which I was struggling with at the time, I wrote it up in the form of a paper, which I've called the Cordoba Initiative, which really is the body of chapter 6 of this book. And to somehow relate the ideas of the book to what is happening today, in yesterday's Financial Times, there was a very interesting and very important article titled, "The United States Starts to Think the Unthinkable About Iraq." And the subline said, the rhetoric may still be confident, but Washington is beginning to ponder the wider implications if its war fails. And the consequences of U.S. defeat in Iraq are, in the words of President George Bush, unthinkable. How is failure defined? It is defined partly as the abrupt withdrawal of most U.S. troops while Iraq dissolves into internecine strife. And instead of the democracy that we had hoped to establish in the region, you have the exact opposite. The article went on to continue, while the official position is one of confidence, there is a growing sense, even within the administration, that they are focusing on supporting the newly selected caretaker government as it tries to organize legislative elections by next January. There is no plan B. The article also quoted some Washington conservative ideologues who wanted war on the grounds that Iraq would become a beacon of democracy for the region. In their view, the mission has already failed. And he quoted Fuad Ajami, professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Johns Hopkins University, who wrote in the New York Times last week that even if Iraq survives, the dream is dead, quote unquote. Let's face it, Iraq is not going to be America's showcase in the Arab Muslim world, admitting that he himself failed to recognize that radical religious beliefs, not democracy, would fill the void left by despotism. Now let me give you the Abdul Rauf plan. Plan B, which should have been Plan A. It is by mapping democracy into Islamic vocabulary. This means unpacking what democracy means, because many people think mistakenly that democracy just means the ballot box. And they wonder, well, why is South Africa not developing? Because we think of democracy as just the ballot box and not the component line items of an independent judiciary, an independent press, an independent central bank, not a central bank that could be the president's son could go and just load cash onto the back of a truck. It means a military that does not have to give the imprimatur, a civilian government not influenced by the military. There are a number of things which Americans and most Westerners think of when they say democracy, but they don't really have a clear idea of what it means. So what is required is unpacking each of these line items, mapping it into Islamic vocabulary, and showing how what we mean by democracy is in fact consistent with the very essence of Islam itself. Is identifying each of these component line items and finding its equivalent in Islamic doctrine or law, and communicating both to the Muslim world that this is what it truly wants, this is what it has always wanted since the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and that the revival, which is what many movements historically in the history of Islam have been about, is to revive the dream of the ideal community of Islam, which in most Muslims' minds was exemplified by the Prophet Muhammad's community in Medina. The challenge has always been, which is the challenge of every religious tradition, not only Islam, but Christianity, Judaism, is what are our eternal principles and how do we restate them in the changing present? This is what we've called, in the middle of the 20th century when I was growing up, the challenge of modernity. Whenever I went with my dad to interfaith ecumenical things, they would say, how does Islam deal with the challenge of modernity? Well, that was a perennial challenge. This is not something new. And the cousin and son-in-law and the caliph, the fourth caliph of Islam, the Caliph Ali, in fact, in one of his very, very wonderful teachings said, bring up your children for a time different from your own. And by the way, Imam Ali is regarded as being the leader of the Shia community. So therefore, if we want to develop democracy in the region, it can be done, and it must be done, and it cannot be done very well if we project it as an exporting of an American idea. It's not like plunking down a McDonald's in Iraq and cutting a ribbon and saying, here is your democracy. It can't be done that way. Even McDonald's caters to the local taste in different parts of the world. In Malaysia, they'll have spicy sauce, and they'll add things to cater to the local taste. But when we want to export democracy, we have to do it the same way McDonald's does it. And if done that way, and articulate that way, this is how we will actually be able to wage the important battle, which is the battle for winning the hearts and minds of the Muslim world. There are two battlefronts here, and there are two fronts that I have been battling on. One is the war against terrorism in the name of Islam, the battle against radical Muslim extremists, as I've pointed out in my book, which has to be done by showing them that the original intention of the Prophet's message was exactly this. This is why the third chapter in my book is what is right with America, and to show that what's right with America and what's right with Islam are in fact very much in sync. 7 centuries ago, one of the most important jurists said all of Sharia law is basically the fulfillment of 5 fundamental human rights. The right to life, the right to freedom of religion, the right to family, the right to property, and the right to what is called, under Muslim law, mental well-being. Now, how similar is this to the American Declaration of Independence, which declares that we were created equal, all men, meaning men and women, were created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which, not all, but among which are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which was originally property. Now, when you unpack the concepts and ideas this way, you will see, this is why I call America a Sharia-compliant state. But the other battlefront is convincing US leadership and opinion leaders in this country that not only about this set of ideas, but that ignoring the role of religion, and certainly Islam, but ignoring the role of religion in dealing with the Muslim world and issues in the region is a recipe for disaster and failure. It's like having a mathematical equation with several variables, but a key variable is absent and missing. Your equation will not describe the accurate physics of the situation as physicists speak about. So whether we're trying to deal with nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan, combating extremism in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, if it's about public diplomacy vis-a-vis Iran, or even resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you can only ignore religion at your peril. And this is part of our problem here, because we have been indoctrinated, those of my generation who are now the leaders of this country, have been brought up in a culture where the separation of church and state implied that religion was something you didn't speak about, unless you spoke it only maybe on Saturdays or Sundays in your temples of houses of worship. Now, ignoring religion will result in religious voices getting sucked in the worst possible way. Both Sunni and Shia clerics and parties have expressed reservations about the new government in Iraq, and my fear is that the insistence on imposing a kind of government that ignores the role of religion will result in radical religious parties holding the trump cards. This is what has happened in Israel with Hamas and Hezbollah, because they've not been brought into the equation. This is what led to the rise of, I mean, this is not just only, this is a very, but it's certainly one of the important factors which has led to the rise of extremism in the name of religion. As I point out in the book, I believe this was part of the rise of fundamentalism in general of the last century, not only in the Muslim world, but also in the West, because religion was dismissed from the boardroom of society. We got to bring religion back in a way that is consistent with both the American notion of what separation of church and state originally meant, which was not that we should not be a religious society, but that the powers of government may not be used to further one religion or one religious doctrine or interpretation over any other. And this very idea is very much consistent with Islamic law. And this is what led to the rise of different schools of interpretation, all of which are recognized under Islamic law as being equally valid. I forgot to take a time off when I started, but I think I'll just end here. I hope you will find the book engaging and interesting and informative, and I thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Before we go to the question and answer, I'd like to mention that there are books from all three of these authors available outside the door. There are also a few copies of our latest Religion Update quarterly supplement to PW, in which we cover books on the intersection of religion and politics and social issues such as business ethics and same-sex marriage. There are not a lot of copies out there. If you don't get one, please visit the PW booth at the entrance to the show floor, and there are plenty more. Okay, we have a gentleman from C-SPAN who's going to be running around with one of those shotgun mics. So when you have a question to ask, I would appreciate it if you would stand and give him a couple of seconds to get close to you, and then go ahead and ask your question. And if there are booksellers in the audience, I would love your comments about what customers are asking for and what people are buying on the topic of Islam. Anybody have a question or a comment? Yes, ma'am.
I was in Spain in the month of April and got to read newspapers that had a European viewpoint. And one of them that really touched me and that I walked away with in trying to understand what's happening with terrorism is that terrorists can thrive because it's more of a social justice atmosphere, the haves and the have-nots, no middle class. Are we looking... Is anybody looking at that social justice piece, the part that you talk about that people need to be happy and prosperous and own property and have all those things for their own happiness? Is the U.S. doing that? How, and is that a correct interpretation of what's fueling some of the terrorism?
Imam Feisal, would you like to take that one?
Thank you. I certainly do believe that much of the what has fueled the rise of militancy and terrorism in much of the Muslim world is the inability of many people to be participants in society. Among the notions of democracy is the opportunity, is basically the spreading around of both power and wealth, which are the two sources of conflict. When people feel that they are not able to participate in the power-making decisions or in the economic well-being, then they feel angry. And one has therefore to look at the etiology and the infrastructures. So the challenge that faces much of the Muslim world is developing and building these societies And as I point out in my book, the development of democracy, and not only democracy in terms of power alone, but also developing the economic well-being of the country, is a very important aspect in terms of addressing the underlying roots of frustration. For instance, many people, just there was an article, I think, in the New York Times last week about people who came from Iraq, soldiers coming from Iraq, and having difficulty integrating themselves back into society, having suicides, murders, divorces, etc. During the 80s and 90s, well, the 80s especially, there was a very strong attempt to draw young Muslim men to participate in the war in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. Many went, they came back. And what makes you think that the very symptoms and problems that these American soldiers returning from Iraq didn't, and they didn't have a system, they didn't have jobs available, they didn't have Veterans Administration benefits, they are accustomed to violence, and this is what actually developed and helped fuel the rise of the kind of that fueled the rise of this kind of militancy that is purely militant without any reason sometimes. This is why we have to look, the part of the Sufi approach, not only the religious approach, but the contemplative approach in every religious tradition is one of healing, and the need to heal people, those at all levels, is a very important thing we need to address. But not only to address it from the spiritual standpoint, but also look at how some of the systems of proper governance can actually bring about this kind of healing.
Professor Esposito?
One of the things that I try to write about in Unholy War and other places is, and it dovetails with what Feisal has just said, we have to realize that we've pretty much turned a blind eye to what's been going on in many Muslim countries. Regimes are authoritarian. Their elites are concerned about power and privilege. You have maldistribution of wealth. You have corruption. And that then dovetails with Western foreign policy. Western governments, American and European, have often supported authoritarian regimes because we see it short-term as in our national interest. It is that support for those regimes, it is the failure to promote democratization, and this has been true under administrations, whether Democrat or Republican, that between the authoritarian regimes and the failure of Western governments, that creates the conditions for the eruptions that we've seen.
Just a quick perspective for me. I think it's important to remember these things, and but it's also important to not to forget. Whenever I appear on Fox News and somebody says something like that, definitely the host will say to me, "Well, weren't most of the 9/11 terrorists from affluent families? And how can you say that? That it's poor people who don't have jobs." And so what I say is what my co-panelists have said is that all these things provide good recruiting material to recruit people from possibly affluent families who are already alienated, and this just sort of adds to the list of things that have been done wrong to Muslims. But I think the real face of Islam and Muslims, most of the Muslim world, sadly and unfortunately, is poor, is hungry, is malnutrition, does not have access to education. About a year ago, last summer, my brother and my mom went to Pakistan for a wedding, and my brother said, "I want to go to the inner city of Lahore," the city that they were in, and my family members told him, "Don't go, and if you're an American, it's dangerous." But my brother's an aspiring filmmaker, student filmmaker, and wanted to sort of capture the poor people of Pakistan. And when he got to this urban village, basically, a few children started gathering around him, and they said, "Are you an American?" And he said yes, and this just sort of wall of children came at him, and he was a little scared because he thought, "Oh, great, they're going to attack me." But actually they all wanted to touch him and meet him, and they wanted to see his video camera, they wanted their picture taken with a video camera, and they were all sort of touching him and saying, "Take my picture." And I think to him and to them, he stands for America and for freedom and for affluence, and I think they want all those things. And it was very touching to me that my brother to those kids could represent hope, and we can't forget that for many of the poor Muslims in the world, that America does stand for hope, and they need our help. They don't need our scorn, they need our help more than anything.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Amy. I'm a bookseller, per your request, at Joseph Beth Booksellers in Cleveland. The book that many people are reading right now is Reading Lolita in Tehran. In fact, I've led several book group discussions on this book, and it's very interesting to me that clearly in the book there is a sense of there's a nuanced range of religious beliefs and practices, and also there is a cultural identity with this is my country. That's one, this is my religion. That's another sense of identity. And there were people, women of faith, who had strong belief systems, who were struggling with the political Islam, and how do you contrast that? So for me, it helped understand a little bit that there is nuance and there is a difference, and it's not just a, I guess the word hegemony, there's not just one fundamentalist block. But unfortunately, what the take-home message for many people reading it is that these are these poor people who have nuance and subtleties in their lives, but, you know, any government, any Muslim government is, or any Islamic government is going to be fundamental. There's this sense of division, that there is this violent and oppressive regime that will oppress especially women. So you asked what people are reading, what people are talking about. That's one thing. And actually, hopefully your books will be an antidote in the memoir section and yours in the, political science and religion sections.
Someone else? Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to send you a little bit in a different direction. And when I tell you that I'm writing inspirational science fiction, you'll wonder why I'm here. But in fiction, we often have a opportunity to allegorize things. And specifically in science fiction, we have that ability more because you can break things down into the basics, and that's what I'm doing with Christianity. But my question has to do with sensitivity. If, for instance, a Muslim person comes across an allegorical statement, such as I'm interested in doing, and recognizes the kinds of things that are going on to them in that book, how is the sensitivity in the general readership? Would they be angry with that? Would they accept the fact that somebody is trying to show them in a good light? I know many Christians are really upset when they come across things like that, and they feel like we're trying to change their religion and that sort of thing and their beliefs. Is there that kind of thinking in the Islam world?
There has been a sense for the last century in much of the Muslim world that Islam has been under attack. It began with not only with the era of colonization, but the nature and quality of colonization, with how the Ottoman Empire was brought to an end, and how Western culture was basically rammed down the throats of many people. And this is one of the points which Huntington points out in his book on the Clash of Civilizations, how torn societies were developed, where the elite were ethnically of the native group, but their mindset, their cultural mindset, down to their clothing, their behavior, their everything, was actually of the West. If you saw the movie Last Samurai or not, but if you look at The Last Samurai and if you study that film from the point of view of its various subcomponents, the challenge of the West, the challenge of holding to tradition, the whole idea of honor, the whole idea of killing oneself, committing suicide for the sake of a cause, all the idea of the honor of being a warrior, all these components and the romanticism of the samurai culture are all part of what Bin Laden stands for. But in spite of that, a century ago there were great Muslim thinkers like Muhammad Abdul, as I point out in my book, and Karen Armstrong points this out as well in her foreword, wanted to take the best of the West and the best of our own traditions. Again, what the movie reflects. We have to be sensitive to our own traditions. And as long as whatever is written expresses the sensitivity to what is essential and fundamental and valuable in the Islamic tradition, that is in fact what Muslims themselves need to develop in their own communities and in their own societies. Certainly as long as that line is recognized and respected, I don't think you'd have a problem.
All true, but part of the difficulty I think we have is that for many Muslims, as for other groups that found themselves minorities and maybe found themselves at a certain point in time feeling as if they were a disenfranchised minority, Italian Americans in my father's generation or even when I was growing up, when you're in that context, your sensitivities are heightened. And therefore, your reaction, your ability to laugh at yourself, to have somebody say something about your religious tradition. Your antennae are always up. You're always waiting for somebody and interpreting what they say quite naturally because there are people who are slamming you, as insulting you. And I think post 9/11 it gets heightened because there are so many people who do slam Islam, so that in other contexts, if people don't know who the author is or what's being said, they may in fact take what's being said quite literally and in fact react or overreact.
I'll just add quickly that it's important to me with both of my books, but especially with my second, because of what I learned from a reaction from a very vocal minority of Muslims who were sort of unreasonably critical and nitpicky. I learned that with my second book, it's really important to work with Islamic scholars and sort of to admit where my shortcomings are. And Professor Esposito did me a great honor and privilege by working with me and sort of from early drafts on, helping me along with some other scholars that I worked with. And actually it's good to work with scholars because sometimes what you think or how you want to write it, once you get the scholarly perspective, it's like, well, that's even better. It makes the writing even stronger. It has a more magical quality to it or more interesting. So I would encourage you to work with scholars and more than one, and I'm sure Imam Rauf or the professor would be happy to oblige. But you have to remember religion is a sensitive topic for everybody. You're always going to have people who are going to be touchy, and you got to go with what's in your heart and hope that that's going to resonate with the reader.
We have time for one more, and then we're going to have to wrap this up, I believe.
Yeah, question for Dr. Esposito. You mentioned that there are some critics that get away with kind of leveling unfair allegations against Islam, like the 85% of mosques being connected to terrorism. Can you talk about why they get away with that?
I think we're in a context where, when I was growing up, I was raised in a totally Italian neighborhood in Brooklyn. And I didn't encounter certain cultural groups until much later. And I would generalize off the one or two people I met. And the same thing happened with my wife when she had to come and meet my family. She had not engaged with Italians. Now, for an awful lot of Americans, there still is not knowing Muslims who are indeed today their neighbors, people in the workplace, etc. But they know Islam through the lens which, if they're older, it's the Iranian Revolution, more recently 9/11. And they therefore they're not able to frame as they do when something happens that relates to somebody who's a Jew or a Christian, because they either come out of that background or a lot of the neighbors are. They're not able to frame that event within a broader context. And so they just draw all kinds of, easy conclusions. And I would also argue that a significant amount of the media, through what it doesn't do, as well as what it does carry, feeds that tendency. And it's not always conscious. Some of it is conscious. I mean, there are people in the media, commentators, who, if you look at the corpus of their work, deliberate. But for others, it's not conscious, but still, it feeds that kind of context that then has people not able to contextualize and interpret what the reality really is on the ground.
May I add a comment to that? Sure. As I point out in my book, Muslims have been in the media a free hit. When I was growing up, cowboy movies would show Westerns would show Native Indians as savages, would show blacks as Tarzan movies would show them as savages, and in much of the movies that we have seen that I grew up with also showed Muslims as being uncouth, womanizers. I mean, there's a certain stereotype which the movie industry really has amplified. Another factor is the issue of race. There's still vestiges within Europe and particularly in America that has not viewed even non-European Christians as being on their radar screen. There are many Christian groups in the Arab world. Arab Christians have been there since the time of Jesus Christ. About 15% of Egyptians belong to Coptic Church. Many Christian groups and are not on the radar screen of most Americans. The same thing with even initially, but less so now, the distinction between Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews. The culture, the richness, the heritage of Sephardic Jews was considered was okay to just ignore. And because Muslims were not primarily of the European culture, of the European race, this has also, I think, contributed to the psychology in the general feeling of much of the Westerners that Islam is an alien religion.
And I would add that the stirring up of controversy and the oversimplification of complicated issues that you often find in the media, the books can certainly be a corrective to that. Obviously, these authors are writing very thoughtful books on a topic that requires that approach. Thank you all for coming today. I hope you can attend some of our other Religion and Spirituality Day events throughout the day as well.
I'm going to head out and see if anybody wants me to.
Sure.
This Understanding Islam panel was one of over 100 conference sessions scheduled over the 4-day BookExpo America in Chicago. Our coverage continues at the bottom of the hour with the Book Babes, co-columnists Margot Hammonds and Ellen Heltzel. And we'll round out today's coverage in about 90 minutes with former President Bill Clinton. In the meantime, a look at some upcoming titles from Miramax Books.
We are walking the floor at BE